Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't know me, I'm Ken Grundy, the National Director of the Australian League of Rights. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today, our annual seminar, where we've put together 3 speakers to deliver some important information to you today. You'll have a good opportunity to ask questions, and as Arnie said, I'm going to remind you again, don't just put your hand up, stand back there, come around, be ready to take your position here. The theme of our seminar is freedoms. You think you've been losing any freedoms lately? Sometimes they're quite gradual and maybe you don't notice them, but I can assure you the pace is quickening. Are you free to not vaccinate your children or your grandchildren in the case of some of us? Well, you're free to not vaccinate them, but if you choose that path, you're not free to go to the childcare or the kindergarten. So gradually you're just losing that little bit of freedom. Are the state governments free to receive their GST? Just lately the federal government is saying if the states do not fully implement their economic potential, they might be sacrificing some of their GST revenue. And reaching their full economic benefit includes allowing fracking of gas mining to go ahead. So if your state is against fracking, the Prime Minister is going to be after you to say, if you don't lift that ban, maybe we're going to pinch a bit of your GST. So there's another little freedom that's gone. How many places in the city can you walk around without being filmed? You didn't offer any permission to do that, did you? I realise that sometimes it's an advantage when they need to check that, but it's a freedom that we've just given up. The League accepts really that with limited constitutional government there will always be some freedom that we can't exercise, because if you want every freedom, well, you haven't got what we call a decent society, you've got anarchy. So we are prepared to sacrifice some freedoms for the benefit of all. And I think the best example of that was ever given was by former league stalwarts like Eric Butler and Jeremy Lee, where we're prepared to sacrifice the right to drive on any side of the road. We just realise the benefit if we just say we'll give up the right to driving anywhere, we just stick on the left-hand side of the road, and that really enhances everyone else's freedom. So it enables everybody to drive wherever they wish without the fear of an accident. So that's what we call limited constitutional government. So the seminar speakers today are going to cover subjects like the rising cost of electricity. If you haven't had a bill lately, you must be due for one and you'll soon get a shock. We're looking for a better way there because that has restricted our freedom. It's a real handicap, the electricity prices. Then we're going to hear about better soil health, delivering better plant health, delivering better personal health. Well, that'll free us from some of these hospitals ramping on the ambulances on the steps of the hospital so you can't get in. And then thirdly, will a financial system deliver a balance between financial wealth and our real wealth? And surely that would enable us some more freedom. The speakers are going to have 45 minutes and that'll be followed by 15 minutes of questioning, and there'll be a break between the second and third for a cup of tea. So I'm going to hand over to Rod Linger from Tasmania. He's going to chair the first speaker, so please give him your attention. Thank you.
It does give me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Moran. Now, Dr. Moran will address Australia's energy crisis, the rising cost of power and reduced levels of system reliability. He will do so by drawing on the context of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the implications of Australia's accession to this, the change brought about by the Trump election, and the policy options for Australia. So I now ask you all to welcome Dr. Alan Moran.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. As Ron said, basically I'm here to talk about the issues of energy in the context of the climate change pressures on Australia and other countries, and the developments that have occurred since then. This is the climate change agreement in Paris wasn't the first of such agreement, and it wasn't the only one. It was more of a function of different things that have been taking place for some time, and it's quite a posit to be here in South Australia, because this is the cutting edge, if you like, of the implications of some of the changes that have been brought about by climate change policies in terms of the energy, and demonstrating the fragility that of the sorts of policies that we've brought on, the fragility and the effects of those on the economy as a whole. And this is my most recent book on this, Climate Change, Treaties and Policies in the Trump Era. And in actually contemplating this book, which was last year, there was a kind of a binary choice contemplating there. We had from the US elections, which were always going to be crucial. We had in the red corner the underdog, who would bring about the end of support for climate change, and in the blue corner we had Hillary Clinton, who favoured a maintenance, perhaps even an intensification of the pressures that had brought about action to reduce carbon dioxide in a global programme. And the contrast couldn't have been greater. President Obama, in his closing address of the presidency, encapsulated the kind of trance-like pursuit of climate action with these words. Let me just quote. He said, "Without bolder action, our children won't have time to debate the existence of climate change. They'll be busy dealing with its effects, environmental disasters, economic disruptions, waves of climate refugees seeking sanctuary." Well, yeah, it wasn't a new view. UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown in 2009 said we had 50 days to save the world from climate catastrophe. 5 years later, in 2014, the French Foreign Minister declared we have 500 days to avoid climate chaos. When Barack Obama became president, James Hansen, who's a self-described climate activist, said that we had 4 years to save the Earth. And a few years later, Tim Wirth, who was the head of the foundation, of the UN Foundation, said Obama's second term was the last window of opportunity to avert a change. Well, maybe. We're actually living in an unusually warm period. We can see from the effects there. We're of course at this part of the year there. The Earth has mainly been quite a lot cooler than it is today. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up and down, but over the last million years is ranged from about 280 parts per million, and largely as a result of combustion fuels, which is in a sense returning the distilled carbon back into the atmosphere. The carbon is created by photosynthesis and plants, etc. So it's returning it back into the atmosphere. We're now at about 400 parts per million. Some people say, "Oh, that's awful. It was increased that much," but it's not. Carbon dioxide is a harmless gas, certainly harmless in any quantities we can imagine. 400 parts per million compares to about 1,500 parts per million, which is common in greenhouses, which many people would wander through all the time without any effects on their health. Now, the effects of this doubling of carbon dioxide has theoretically an effect of increasing the temperatures of the world by 1 degree Celsius. After the doubling, there's no effect because it's kind of logarithmic. There's no further effect after that. But the scare hypothesis, and 1 degree Celsius, most people would agree is trivial. It's just moving 200 kilometres further north in an Australian context. The scare hypothesis comes about because the people would say, well, have said that this is going to be amplified by water vapour, and that has an additional effect. This is the effect that's totally unproven at the moment. Indeed, the most celebrated atmospheric physicist in the world, Professor Linson from MIT. He rejects that plausibility of this amplification, and indeed the data we have, we only have really good data since the satellites were available in 1979. The data we have, and I'll come to this, seem to indicate that this hasn't been the case. It's likely that there'll be some warming takes place, but not very much. What we can say is that the forecasts of droughts and pestilence and hurricanes and sea level rise and harvest failures, loss of polar bears, all these disasters, including climate refugees, haven't taken place. And one of the features of this, the reason why, is that if we look in terms of the data we have, this hard data we have from 1979, whereas the big red line there discusses the average of these models, these forecasting models, the actual outcome has been much less. The forecasted model said, well, we should have been increasing our temperatures by 3 degrees globally, by 3 degrees Celsius since over the last 25, 30 years. Whereas in fact the increase has been quite trivial. It's been less than 0.3 degrees Celsius, and as we can see from the blue and the green line at the bottom, they're the actual measures. And again, one of the aspects of this is that the red line, the red dots are showing where we've been in some of these eras, and the red dots show not very much of an increase at all that we can see. And the other thing is that people are talking about the hurricanes. That's pretty topical at the moment. But the hurricane levels, these are the North Atlantic hurricane intensity. Even though the IPCC, which some of you will know is the international body which was behind the Paris Agreement, which looked at the hurricanes in that period and said, oh, look, they're going up and up and up. But if you look at the longer term, they're not going up and up and up. They're pretty dead. They're dead straight. There's no change in hurricanes. One of the aspects of the IPCC report was drought, and a key feature of that was Australia. And we had the great millennial drought in Australia. So this is the rainfall of southern Australia. People were looking at that era then and said, oh, look, it's never going to rain again. The dams are never going to fill. This is a feature of global warming. But then the drought broke, and if you look at the longer term, there's no trend in Australian rainfall, and nor for that matter anywhere else. So people like Tim Flannery, who hails from this town, said that we weren't going to fill the dams again. It's been proven to be wrong. It's still celebrated for whatever reason. Australia's top civil servant, whose name is Martin Parkinson, forecast these waves and waves of climate refugees. That hasn't happened either. Well, some people see the dire consequences, catastrophic consequences for the climate. The other way of looking at it is that doing something about it would lead to dire economic consequences, and that's the sort of thing that we're facing in Australia right now. Climate change policies is to me is not just important because it's one of a raft of issues, but it's crucial to defining. It's a crucial economic marker in politics. Those wishing to avert the supposed detrimental effects of human-induced global warming stand ready, without any evidence, to require a fundamental redirection of normal market activities involving buying and selling and producing and consuming. And in doing so, they actually exhibit a predilection for overriding individual preferences with those of their own. And this is best expressed by the former head of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the Paris body, which took the Paris Agreement to which Australia's agreed to, brought it forward. Her name was Christiana Figueres, and she said the task is to intentionally transform the global economic model for the first time in human history. So the issue has become a contemporary dichotomy between central and individual control. Just to summarize where we are, the world's developed economies have all placed penalties on coal, which accounts for 40% or more of electricity supply, more than that, 70% roughly in Australia, and to a lesser degree gas. The key objective is to substitute wind and solar for coal, which is about 1/3 of the cost. Coal is about 1/3 of the cost of these renewables, and is of course far more reliable. And Australia, not only is it 1/3 of the cost, but electricity is indispensable to modern life. And Australia's industry structure has been defined by low-cost electricity, which is, the comparative advantage we have in Australia. It's created the aluminium, the smelting, farming industries, which are dependent upon low-cost electricity, low-cost and stable, reliable electricity. The reduction of in gas emissions from the 2015 Paris Agreement anticipates, if all countries fall into line, that the stabilisation of atmospheric gas will occur by the end of this century. One problem is that the disciplines actually only apply to the developed countries, and they account for only 40% of the emissions, and that share is declining. Now, with the Trump election, the US has pulled out of the agreement, and so those countries in the agreement, which is like Australia, are just 25% of emissions. And indeed, the absurdity, the idiocy of our own government was that we actually announced the agreement, the ratification of the agreement, the day after Trump was elected president. So it was known that Trump was going to pull out, but the very next day, Turnbull and Frydenberg got up on the stage and said, we have ratified this agreement and we're going to save the world for it. Total absurdity. So we've arrived at a position whereby the developed OECD countries, the developed world, have agreed to their emissions by 26%, 28% in our case, 40% in the case of the EU, and all countries have marked on some versions of this. In Australia's case, these requirements cost about $5 billion per year. I'll come to how that's comprised, but it's basically because of subsidies we give to the renewable energy, which is paid for out of other energy, and because of disbursements from Commonwealth and state budgets. But in addition to this, we have other features which have been greatly deleterious to our economy. One of them, I was talking with some of you people earlier on. One of them was land policies we've introduced, which was introduced by the Howard government of all governments, but was implemented by the two state governments in New South Wales and Queensland, whereby farmers' land was taken off them without any compensation. Basically, the planning rules were amended, and they weren't allowed to grow, they weren't allowed to clear things, they weren't allowed to harvest timber, they weren't allowed to irrigate their land. All in the process, they had to sterilise the land because that would save greenhouse gases. There was no compensation given to them. I appeared to one of the celebrated cases with Peter Spencer, a New South Wales landowner and he saw his land, which was worth about $9 million, planned out of existence, out of any worth, until it was worth $2 million, and then the government offered to buy it for the $2 million that they had reduced its value to, which was absurd and disgraceful. Barnaby Jones actually estimated overall in Australia there was about a $200 billion cost of these sorts of measures, which again were made by the Commonwealth Conservative or Liberal government and the Labour governments as well. So I think that's a disgraceful stain on our economy and our politics. So how did we get here? Well, I think there's a whole lot of things that came together at one time. There's been a known effect of carbon dioxide since the 19th century, and that's always been an undercurrent thing. Well, if we are industrializing, then there will be carbon dioxide. That must have some effect on the atmosphere as a whole, and it does. But it came into prominence much more when we saw the great defining effects events of the 20th century, which was the collapse of communism, and that sort of implosion of socialism created a vacuum for activists, And so we had a second factor coming into place. Environmental concern became a talismanic sort of thing to bring people to overturn the established order. Now there wasn't that goal of socialism. And Cristina Figueres, who I quoted earlier, she epitomizes this idea that we will use this environmental issue to actually restructure the world in a different way. And a lot of people see that as doing this through nudging us along, nudging towards renewable energy, which they think is an inevitable path. I mentioned Australia's cost, but there are other costs as well. In the US, indeed, the environmental industry is about $1.5 trillion per year, and that means considerable amounts of money is being spent on energizing and motivating scientists and academics and others within the national elites, and this allows them to prosper as long as we don't, as long as the other people don't mind too much. This global nature, though, of greenhouse gases brought into play a third factor, because if the issue is genuine, the only way in which it can be combated is by an international movement of things, and we had started moving on these international measures, things like migratory birds and Antarctica and whaling. Global agreements had been developed over the past 60 or 80 years on these matters, and in the 1980s we saw a new one come forward, which was acid rain. This was all the vogue there. It was said to be polluting Scandinavian lakes and corroding the German forests. So we had various measures brought into place. They were kind of voluntary, but in the way they were voluntary, but the voluntary nature of them created pressures to actually do things. But none of the things that we did to combat these so-called deleterious effects actually cost all that much. And in fact, the totemistic one, acid rain, actually invited measures to suppress sulfur dioxide emissions, and it's turned out to be totally harmless to lakes and forests. But then we saw a major one on ozone, a hole in the ozone layer, depletion there, CFCs, and this was supposed to be creating certain sorts of catastrophe for mankind. Well, we actually did develop, the world did develop measures to suppress the CFCs, that is, the ozone depleting gases. It wasn't all that expensive a thing to do, and there aren't any of them done now. Ozone depletion may have had some sort of effect, but it was nothing like as catastrophic as people were suggesting. The whole pattern of these things was brought into place by so-called voluntary actions, what is known as intended nationally determined contributions. So people all agree in these international meetings they're going to do things, and we're not taking anyone's sovereignty because it's all voluntary. That said, once they're in place, governments feel morally bound. In fact, it's very difficult for them to step out of these agreements once they're made. And indeed, an illustration of this was Canada, which had an option in terms of the Kyoto Agreement, which is a predecessor of the Paris Agreement in 1997. Canada was gung-ho, had a left wing. Trudeau is the government there, the father of the present premier. He was gung-ho to do things and made all sorts of obligations. In fact, Canada couldn't meet its obligations. It could have done, but it would have had to have done the sort of thing that Australia did, which is actually sequester the land, take it away from their farmers, and the Canadians had a certain a greater moral fibre than we did, and they found that was totally unconscionable, so they didn't do it. So Canada then reneged and faced a lot of obloquy, opposition as a result of that. And of course, the American essential reneging on by Trump of the Paris Agreements has met with a cacophonic sort of opposition. One of the things about all these agreements is that it is suggested that look, the cost of doing something won't be very great, and in fact, the implications of not doing something will be colossal. Many of us remember the Garneau report here, which was done by the Labour government, and there was a UK version of that called the Stern report. And this sort of said, look, if we don't do something, basically they went through the various aspects of warming and what it would amount to. It would be 10, 20, 30% of GDP would be wiped off as a result of this increase in emissions. Well, to its credit, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is behind all this, it happened to have a couple of people in there who looked at the economics and took a much more sober view. They basically thought that they looked at all the estimates of this and they dismissed Garneau and Stern because Garneau and Stern weren't peer reviewed. They were just sort of government reports. They weren't subjected to any kind of scrutiny by others. So they looked at four. One of which, the second one there, wasn't really relevant because it's just self-reported happiness. But the others by Nordhaus and Berzello and Rosen van der Mensburg found much more modest reduction. I mean, these took the worst possible scenarios that we would have more rain, we would have fewer crops, we'd have a whole lot of things as a result of the global warming, and worked out what it would be. And the numbers were like the impact on GDP was 2 or 3% negative. Now that's in the context of a century-wide period under which GDP increases by 100% or more over the global GDP. So the effect really is quite trivial. But the IPCC actually didn't show the same rigor when they were looking at what the cost would be of us ceasing to do that. They said, oh well, basically it won't cost very much because the march of history is such that renewables are the new thing. They're going to be cheaper than coal fairly soon, and we'll just put taxes on coal or on carbon dioxide, and this will then drive us into this new nirvana of renewable energy. Well, we tried that. We tried that in Australia. We're still doing it, and we even put a carbon tax on under Gillard. That tax was only $24 a ton, which was much smaller than would be required to bring about the suppression of the emissions. And of course, that tax was already having some great effects on Australia, some terrible effects in terms of the costs. And Tony Abbott won an election by saying he would reduce it. But I mean, that's only one aspect of the cost that we've incurred here. We've got renewable targets. We're supposed to get to, in the next 3 years, a supply share of 23%, 23.5% for renewables, which means 15% for wind and solar. Now, we're nowhere near the 15% yet, but what we've actually seen with getting to the 15%, we're about 9%, is the forced closure of power stations. The worst was here in the Northern Power Station here and Hazelwood in Victoria. And so because wind comes in with these subsidies, the subsidy for wind basically, the numbers basically are wind gets $85 or $88 to $85 subsidy for a product worth about $40. So it gets 3 times as much as coal. And in doing so, it's driving out the coal because it has an automatic priority so it drives out coal, and coal closes, which raises the whole cost of the price of the market price for all other forms of energy. So we've still got, even under the existing program, if we stop the program, we're still going to a long way to go. We're still going to see further displacements and further closures. This is just some of the costs that I'd worked out. It's about $5 billion a year. The biggest element of the costs are these for renewable energy. That's for large scale. That's the rooftops, 240. But there's a whole lot of state schemes as well, including here in South Australia. And then there's a whole lot of government direct subsidies from the budget. And the answer comes to something of the order of $4.85 billion every year. We're paying for this. We're paying $4.8 billion every year so that we can have dearer electricity. I mean, it's just total insanity. And so not only so we're driving the prices up as they go. And here is this is the forward price. It's actually a little bit old, but it's not changed at all. If you look at terms of the cost of it, this is the wholesale cost of electricity. This is Victoria, but they're all pretty much the same. We were $42, $43 per megawatt hour back in then. We're now up to $100 and something per megawatt hour. I mean, when people say, we've got the energy prices have gone up, well, this is the reason why. This is the wholesale price has gone up like that, and the wholesale price has gone up like that, because around this period we saw these major closures of power stations, and we'll see even more than the wholesale price will go up even further. What we've seen here is a transformation of Australia. This is the before and after measure. Australia. This is Australia. We were the cheapest. That's household, and this is business industry. We were just about the cheapest in the world in any sustained basis. Those that were cheaper than us was places out South Africa who had temporary subsidies in. This is where we were in 1999. I think it's 1999. Yeah, 1999. We were there. I mean, there's a reason why we were there, because we got a lot of coal, and it's the cheapest in the world. We got a lot of gas, and it's the cheapest when we had a certain amount of hydro electricity. So the coal is the cheapest and the best place in the world. So that's where we were. This is from the Finkel report. I mean, who's terribly biased anyway. And Finkel shows now where we are now. We're suddenly at one of the highest. Here's where Australia is now, and we're up in the same price as Japan and Switzerland and UK and Greece, etc. Places which have got quite high. All of this is due to the energy policies which have been pursued by successive Australian governments. We would be down here. We would be at the cheapest level in the world if we allowed our energy market to operate without the bias that we have in place. So, but not only we've seen these prices, but we've seen the reliability degraded, and the 3 days mandatory holiday we had in South Australia is just one function of that. We've seen this, and we've seen the jewels in our industrial crown closing, the aluminium smelters and other smelters which used about 15%, still do, about 15% of our electricity. Why? Because the electricity was cheaper than anywhere else in the world here. We're propping these industries, which are terrifically productive industries, by subsidies because the energy price has gone up so much as a result of the government policies. So, and what did Malcolm Turnbull do? He appointed a Green zealot, Alan Finkel, is his chief scientist. He's not a scientist, an engineer. Nothing wrong with engineers, but he's hardly a chief scientist. And he appointed them to give him the solutions to the energy crisis that was then apparent to all. And his solution was, let's do even more of it. Let's have even more renewables. And Turnbull, of course, is predisposed to agree to that. But on the other hand, the catastrophe is so obvious to everybody now that they're having to try and figure out a way in which it can save face and not totally destroy the economy. Well, whatever's been done isn't enough. So, Australia agreed to the climate agreement. We agreed to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide 26 to 28%. But as I say, there was no such restraints on China and India and all the developing countries which are going gung-ho in terms of using coal, Australian coal mainly because it's cheaper, to power their economy. And so the overall effect on the global emission levels, if that is an important effect, is pretty well zero. The Paris Agreement really came out of an axis between the EU and Obama. Obama's gone. Trump has reneged on it, and he's unwinding. Daily there are reports of how he's unwinding any of the restraints that are on coal and on gas in the USA. And as a result of that, we're seeing industry sucked from the rest of the world into the USA because their electricity prices are cheap, much cheaper than in Australia, and firms like BMW and Volkswagen are shifting production to the United States because Germany is just too dear. But Trump's decision has really removed the last fig leaf from any credibility of the Paris Agreement. It can't work. Those countries applying its strictures are engaging in fruitless self-harm. The only solution is to cancel it. And domestically, that means ceasing all subsidies to energy products. It's not enough to call for a pause in these subsidies, since that will mean a continued drain on the competitiveness of Australia, a loss of reliability and higher consumer costs. Australia's been more aggressive than most in forcing its decarbonisation, and as a result we've moved in the last decade and a half from being the cheapest source of electricity and gas to one of the dearest. Subsidies to wind and solar, and those sources favoured access to the electricity grid, have caused coal stations to operate in an uneconomical stop-start mode, and the outcome has been that they're closed, and we've lost that stable generation which they produced. We've seen a doubling of prices, and and we're losing these energy-intensive industries like smelting, and actually we're also facing more problems with many farming industries, which are, of course, pretty reliant on cheap energy for the processing of farming produce. I think the only thing we can do is to announce an immediate cessation of the subsidies in place and return to an electricity market which is neutral between different sources. This is the message which Tony Abbott's been giving. It's a message which I like to think I've influenced him to give. It's one that he's giving now. He's setting the agenda. Even he gave a speech in London a week or so ago. Everyone knew what was going to be in that speech. Even before it, the government was running amok to try to work out, anticipate it, and to do what they're going to do to weaken the sorts of deleterious policies they've put in place on energy. So he's setting the agenda, but the question is, can we do it fast enough? Are we actually going to face a gradual deindustrialization, gradual increase in prices as a result of us doing too little too late to actually extricate ourselves from this process? It would be neat to say, well, the whole thing will collapse and the South Australian thing will happen again and again, and then everyone will come to their senses. Maybe that will happen, but it's much more likely, in my view, that we'll just see the sort of boiling frog thing, where it just gets more and more difficult until nobody recognises what's happened, until it's much too late to operate. But if that's the case, we'll see our standard of living fall quite markedly over the years to come, and a totally different Australia.
Doctor, the whole public are very concerned about this global warming. I made my living out of hothouses for a dozen years and know a little bit how they operate. And we make them by enclosing a space with a film of either once glass and now plastic. The Earth's hothouse is enclosed in a film of gas. And as I understand it, at any point on Earth, there is probably about 70 inches of water suspended above your head at any time. And it's quite accepted that 95% of the hothouse effect on Earth is actually water vapour. So we're already down to 5% that could possibly be affected. And it's generally concluded that CO2 is 2% of the hothouse effect. So if you're going to have an effect on CO2, it's going to be minimal, and that is obvious, but nobody tells us that. Can you confirm that something like those figures?
Yeah, I think they're the figures I understand. And what they argue, the alarmists argue, they can't dispute your 2% and the effect of that could only have a trivial effect, but they say that will excite the water molecules and it'll create more water vapor through it. There'll be a compounding effect, which has got some plausibility, but it's not been found to be true in terms of empirical evidence. So
not much.
Yeah, there's no evidence that feedback effect to increase water and therefore expand the temperatures even further is taking place.
I can't help but bother to ask the question concerning Tony Abbott and the now conflict between he and that Goldman Sachs banker and thus financier, Malcolm Turnbull. Given that Abbott originally pushed the issues of global warming and now is, as he demonstrates physically, nothing more than a pugilist, wanting to brawl with Malcolm Turnbull on any given occasion in defence of what you've been saying, would you care to comment on how do we listen to an intelligent conversation from these politicians?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, Abbott has come and gone on. Well, the first thing is politicians are retailers, aren't they? I mean, they don't really. There's no politician really who's a deep thinker hardly in the whole Parliament. They're not stupid, of course, but they're retailers. They listen around and they reflect what they're hearing. Certainly, Abbott, he was a global warming skeptic at one time. The most interesting one is John Howard, who actually started the policy of renewable in Australia, and now says it was his greatest mistake ever made, because he introduced the first renewable program, albeit at a relatively small level. But he now realizes that was a terrible mistake, and he's said so on many occasions publicly. Abbott had certainly taken the view that this was a real problem, and that's when he defeated Turnbull the first round for the leadership, and he campaigned and won government on that basis to withdraw the carbon tax of Julia Gillard. Once in government, these people, though, they get surrounded by a whole lot of people, others, and they say, "Oh, look, this Paris Agreement, we can make it because normal forces will mean that the way our economy is progressing and all this and efficiencies and things, we will make this without any real problem. So we can sign on to this and therefore avoid becoming an international pariah." And so he signed on to it. Once he lost office, the effects of the policies that are contributing to the Paris Agreement were becoming more and more obvious. So he's been campaigning on that issue, and I think he's got it dead right. He's got it dead right. Now people would say, well, he's had his chance and didn't do anything there. In fact, he made the process even worse, and that might be the case. But I don't see any other prospect than him to do this. Of course, there are some of the minor parties, and we were talking earlier, the One Nation Party certainly has got the right kind of policies there, as has Cory Bernardi in this state, and the Liberal Democrats. So there are these minor parties which are becoming more than minor parties at the present time, who actually all follow the same sort of agreed policy goals as mine as well, and a great chunk of the Liberal Party does too, and then probably all the Nats. So where we go from here, the only credible champion there at the moment is Tony Abbott. Hopefully, I don't know whether he'll get back in power, but there's at least a chance he will, or that if he makes a challenge, somebody else will, and there are a couple of people who might adopt the same sort of policies. But he's all part of his own ambition, I agree as well. But nonetheless, his policies are the right policies right now.
Because I live on an island, and one of the issues of global warming is the alleged sea level rise. I live on an island, have done now for over 60 years, and I can tell you how much the sea level has risen around my island. Exactly 0. And how do I know? Every day I deal with the sea. I have to drag my tinny either over sandbars or over rocks or up the town jetty in Port Lincoln, and I can tell you those same sandbars and those same rocks, etc., I'm dragging it over. And incidentally, I can show you reports presented I've done what's called a DPA over Boston Island for future development. Coastal sea level rise, I'm supposed to plan for something like 1 metre sea level rise. It is farcical. And that one single fact of sea level rise, which is endemic as part of the problem of global temperature rise, there's been no impact around Port Lincoln.
The thing about it is, sea level has risen in a lot of places around the world. It's fallen in a lot of places. It rises and falls. You know, the answer is, overall, there's been no change in sea level rise. I mean, if there has, it's been, you know, like a centimetre a century. I mean, it's just things that just don't make any sense. I mean, and we watch those alarmist films by people like Al Gore, and you see the whole of New York being swathed in water. I mean, it's just absurd. No serious scientist believes it. But you know, it makes great theatre, and it's terrific for those people who, the alarmists and the ABC and a whole lot of areas in the media, think it's great because, you know, it shows, you know, how, you know, capitalism is such an evil thing, and it's ruining the world, and you know, we need sensible people like them to actually curtail its effects.
Given that One Nation, Pauline Hanson, is a rising power, would appear to be a resurrected power in terms of the nation, and relative to the cost of electricity, which is exploding away, as you, Chairman Ken, put out when you introduced Alan, how does One Nation feel about global temperature rise, the associated costs, and how maybe the nation might handle? I mean, does it have a position? Is it pro or anti the politically correct position of global sea level rise, temperature rise, and so on? Or does it have an alternative?
Well, yeah, One Nation is pretty straight on this. They think it's total rubbish. In terms of the science, it's total rubbish, and they recognise that the economics is destroying the nation and things as well. They certainly want to see coal power stations built. They certainly want to see the end of all these subsidies that are creating the distress that we've seen. They have policies, and you may have the same one. Some of you do, opposed to fracking. I'm not opposed to that, but they have those sorts of policies. But by and large, One Nation considers that renewable targets have to be removed immediately, and if necessary, we should build with using government money to build coal power stations if in fact that you can't do it commercially.
Are you aware that the driver, or I put to you that the drivers for this rollout of policy is coming from conspicuous lobbyists within what we call our Capitol Hill, what Trump calls the draining of the swamp? And specifically, I put to him the question of an entity called Clean Energy Solutions, with two directors being Michael Photius and Christina Photius. Are you aware that the drivers, whose one of their primary clients is AGL, and are you aware that these entities are engaged in a systematic and deliberated campaign to implement that?
Yes, I do know about the lobbyists involved, and yes, I do know about AGL, and it's not only AGL, but in a lot of ways, even though VC and ABL is a noxious character, a dreadful fellow, but I mean, I don't really blame him, because he's after the bottom line. How will I improve my shareholders' return? That's all he wants. And so a system has been created where you can say, well, I can do this by being in open competition and finding the consumer needs and building this, taking risks, or I can do it by getting a subsidy from the government. Well, you know, it's a lot easier to make money from a subsidy from the government, and so he's doing that. The answer is, don't ever listen to what private enterprise, what business firms tell you to do. They've got a very legitimate role in the economy, and that is to actually maximise their shareholders' profits. They'll do it whatever legal way they will do it. And so when they're all piling, and the Business Council and BHP and AGL and Origin Energy, they're all talking about this. They're talking their book. They're talking what their own vested interests are, not what the national interests are. And it needs people to actually stand up and say, no, that isn't the national interest. That is destroying the nation. People like you and me should be saying that. We are saying that. Whether we can make the headway to actually avert the coming catastrophe, I don't know. But, you know, you can but try.
So have you come across
Doctor, many authentic sources of alternative energy that are worthy pursuing in the longer run. I realise that this is perhaps in the short need, the immediate situation we're going to attend to that, but
I've been around this area since 1990, roughly, one way or another, and there's always been this alternative energy has been, 5 years ahead. It's going to be great, and it's coming along, and certainly it's gotten cheaper. But if you look at the wind and the solar, they've gotten cheaper. But this it's coming down in a trajectory like that. In other words, they get cheaper, and then it gets more and more difficult to do it. It's more and more difficult. It's called a parabolic trajectory. Somebody would know. So we're now getting to a situation where all of these gee-whiz solutions have reached the point where it's difficult that they can get any cheaper. Wind has gone as far as it can go. Solar probably can go some further, but solar is actually twice the price of wind, twice the cost of wind, and so it probably can go further. People have talked about other novel things like wave power, but wave power is a bit like wind. It's a massive amount of power, but actually tapping it and converting it to concentrated energy is very difficult. The answer to all of these things is the more concentrated the energy source, the cheaper it is by and large. So the cheapest is uranium, but it costs you an awful lot to make sure it doesn't explode and have other sorts of side effects. Coal and petroleum and other fossil fuels are similarly cheap. Water, hydro, as long as you can get enough of it concentrated, that also is very cheap. But I can't see any of these new solutions being a solution. Batteries, and we have the situation in this state of batteries with the Elon Musk thing. Batteries are just storage. Batteries, it costs you 30% to actually store the energy from a battery and then to release it. They're no solution. They could help. And again, a similar solution is Snowy Mark II, which is the Turnbull solution. But that's pumping the water uphill and bringing it down again. It has a solution. It may have a merit, but it's not an answer. So I can't see what would displace coal or gas as a power source in the near future, nor petroleum. If you like, electric cars may well displace petroleum, but electric cars run on coal in the end. They run on electricity. So yeah, I can't see what the future is. Some of these solutions, like the solar panels, they've been invented for centuries, or at least a century and a half, and have been perfected and improved over that period, but they haven't actually provided a solution.
Doctor, I'm from Tasmania, and just recently we're hearing a lot of talk about pumped electricity, pumped hydro. And I can't understand, like I've been and had a look at the Snowy scheme, and I can understand there that there's pumping stations there where they drop the water down in, I can't name the pond, but they drop it down. I can understand that they must be using thermal overload, if you like, to pump it back up in the off-peak period. I can see sense in that. I can't see the sense in Tasmania. What's the point of just pumping it up? I can understand when you're pumping it from a low level and you gain a lot of head out of it. That's fine. But to just drop it into a pond and then pump it back and think you're going to, is there any benefit in that?
Well, yeah, no, there isn't. The only benefit is if there's a hybrid system whereby you've got some fossil fuels and that and another benefit, which is when you've got spillage. Maybe then but by and large, I don't think there is. Is there such things in Tasmania?
No, they've been talking about it. I couldn't understand because we've got a link now with Victoria, so that's the only way I can see there's a benefit if we're going to get cheap off-peak electricity to do it. Maybe.
Well, but that's gone by the board because there's no cheap electricity anymore from Victoria. Basically that worked. That was a great idea when Hazelwood was operating, and we had $40 a megawatt. In fact, $15 a megawatt hour off peak. You can look at the off. It's off peak right now. If we looked at the price now in the national market, as at this moment, there isn't any off peak at all. It's 85. It's 55 in Tasmania, 63 here, 79. Now, 2 years ago, these $60, $70, $80 ones would have been $25 at this time on a weekend. But they're no longer like that. So there's no cheap power, and coming into, in fact, at this point in time, Tasmania is exporting power to Victoria.
So the way I'm reading it, even if they do away with the coal stations on the mainland here, even the pumping stations here in the state, in Victoria or New South, are a bit pointless if they haven't got thermal energy to do it with.
I just want to know, what was the website you just looked at?
Red Dolphin Systems. Red Dolphin Systems. Yeah, and it shows you, if you can see it, it shows a whole lot of things, how much is travelling between each state, and what the price is, at 5-minute intervals in each state, and all that sort of stuff.
I noticed on your very first chart, most of the temperature readings were below zero. I've also noticed a similar thing on the NASA website where they chart the temperatures over the last 100 years. Unless all the temperature probes are in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, how can you explain that?
Actually, no, they're not below zero. That's some sort of an average. It's the Vostok, which is in the area. There's a series. Vostok is a very stable area, which has been stable for millions of years. And so they take the temperatures there, and there's a strong correlation between the Vostok temperatures and those in the rest of the world. So yeah, you're right. It is taken in a cold area, but it's an area which everybody agrees is pretty well a good marker in terms of the ups and downs of the temperatures.
Also, those temperature readings, both there and also those taken around the world, are they the actual temperature readings? Are they available on the web? Yeah. They are.
The ones on the most accurate are the computer, the satellite ones, which they're available from NASA. University of Alabama is the best site. There are other sites as well, and they show monthly temperatures from 1979.
What about going back to 1910?
Well, you've got to then use proxies. One of the issues here is that global warming, human-induced global warming, could not have had any effect before about 1950. There's nobody thinks it could. It's just the accumulation of carbon dioxide could have only started having an effect after about 1950, and probably not until the mid-70s. So you go back with proxies, and you can look at those proxies. If you look at 1910, the answer is that the proxies show that 1910 to about 1940, temperatures rose, then they fell for a number of years to about 1975, and there was a whole lot of worries about global cooling and all that sort of stuff. Then they started rising. They rose quite rapidly for about 10 or 15 years. Since then, they've been stable. They've not changed at all.
I'm a bit puzzled by the level of prices. I'm not questioning what you've got up there, but whether it's the renewables or the traditional, people have set up their business according to the result they might get at the end of the day. So we've got these high prices right now, so I don't care whether it's this new battery or whether they get a new coal mine, clean coal, or whether it's solar panels. Do they think that they're going to generate electricity and get these prices? Because if they do, we are not going to ever benefit.
No, but basically, solar or batteries or whatever locks us into the existing, and I'm talking wholesale prices, and the existing wholesale price of about $80, $90, $100 compared to the $40 that we once had. And if we build a new power station, there's a very interesting case in this, because the Minerals Council commissioned work to examine what the cost would be of a new brown or black coal power station in the eastern states of Australia. And the answer was below $50. In other words, half of the $50, that's for a new one, not for something that's already been amortized. These are new ones. And they published that. and it was so much against the interests and the philosophy of BHP in this case that they fired the head of the Mineral Council. I mean, for actually telling the truth what they are. They could not stand this. They're you know, so the big Australian basically is part of the whole mafia, which is destroying our economy.
Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Dr. Moran, firstly for making the effort to come to South Australia. He said in his address that he was in Brisbane yesterday, Adelaide today. You might be home with your families tomorrow or later tonight, but I guess we've got to be thankful for modern aircraft travel that it enables that to happen. But among the points that you made today was that I think it was a lady who said that they want to readjust the whole world and they're using this tool, and that's something the League of Rights has recognised in a number of fields, and we've been promoting that this is just another method of getting a little bit more control. Not a little bit, it's a fair bit of control, yes. So I do want to thank you for your address today. It's been very enlightening, and you've obviously been spreading it everywhere, but we're going to help spread it further with this recording, and as a small mark of our appreciation, I'd like you to accept this and wish you safe travel home. Thank you.